Northern Michigan, 1898. Late fall, weeks before the Great Outbreak. Elias Rourke was still hammering boards while his neighbors had long finished their cabins for winter. They called it wasted labor. They called him a fool. While others built standard 12 by 16 shanties with single walls and basic chinking, Rourke was constructing what looked like a junk closet, a 4-foot deep lean-to running the full 16-foot length of his north wall. Caleb Haskins, who'd helped build half the cabins in the settlement, couldn't believe the waste. "Build tighter, chink harder, burn more wood," he sneered. "Don't waste nails on a closet for trash." Rourke filled his lean-to with hay, broken handles, spare boards, and feed sacks. The mockers laughed harder. Then February 10th, 1899 arrived. The Great Arctic Outbreak slammed the country. Baldwin, Michigan hit 49 below zero. Standard cabins failed, frost formed on interior walls, chinking cracked. Under wind pressure, families burned through cord after cord of wood, but still couldn't stop the cold from stealing their heat. But Rourke's cabin, the north wall that should have been the coldest, became the warmest. His useless room was doing something no amount of firewood could do. It was changing the rules of heat loss. What did he understand about wind pressure and thermal protection that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The wind drove hard against the north wall that November night, and Elias Rourke could feel every gust through the chinking. Frost crept along the interior log seams like fingers of ice, and each blast made the moss and clay mixture whistle through gaps he thought he'd sealed tight. The cabin didn't just feel cold, it felt porous, as if the wind could reach right through the wall and touch his living space. When wind can penetrate your shelter wall, the stove becomes nothing more than a liar, promising heat it cannot deliver. Rourke's cabin measured 12 feet by 16 feet, the standard size for a single man's claim shanty in northern Michigan timber country. Like most frontier dwellings, it faced the practical realities of limited lumber, hand tools, and the pressing need for shelter before snow made construction impossible. The north wall took the worst punishment from the prevailing winds that swept down from the Great Lakes, carrying moisture and cold that seemed to find every weakness in the log joints. The next morning, Rourke announced his intention to build what he called a lean-to against that north wall. His neighbor Caleb Haskins, who worked at the local sawmill and had helped raise half the cabins in the settlement, immediately objected. "You're wasting good lumber and precious nails," Haskins declared, using the tone of a man who'd seen enough failed building projects to recognize folly. "Build tighter, chink harder, burn more wood. Don't throw away materials on some junk room that won't even keep you warm." The criticism echoed what Daniel Carter Beard had documented about frontier building disputes. Established settlers often dismissed innovative construction as the work of mossbacks, men who couldn't grasp proper building methods. Haskins represented the conventional wisdom that dominated frontier construction: speed over experimentation, accepted techniques over untested ideas, and the belief that any shelter problem could be solved with more fuel and better chinking. Rourke ignored the mockery and began his work anyway. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who trusted his own judgment over community opinion. First, he set upright posts 4 feet out from the existing north wall, spacing them every 6 feet along the 16-foot length. These posts would carry the weight of his lean-to roof and create the foundation for what others saw as an elaborate storage closet. Next, he nailed a horizontal ledger board to the cabin wall at a height of 7 feet, creating an attachment point for his rafters. The rafters ran from this high ledger down to a beam that connected his outer posts, creating a simple shed roof that would slope away from the cabin and shed rain and snow. The mathematics were straightforward. A 4-foot depth would give him sufficient storage space while keeping the structure simple enough to build with hand tools and salvaged lumber. For the outer wall, Rourke used rough-sawn boards, whatever the mill could spare or sell cheap. He wasn't building a second room that needed to look finished or maintain precise tolerances. This was purely functional construction, designed to create a barrier between the wind and his cabin wall. He left small gaps between some boards rather than fighting to make every joint perfect. This wasn't meant to be airtight, just wind resistant. The roof went on next, covered with whatever would shed water effectively. In his case, that meant a combination of boards and tar paper, materials that weren't beautiful but would keep precipitation from rotting his stored goods. The entire structure took him 2 full days of daylight work, using only hand tools and accepting that winter construction meant working fast rather than working pretty. Most importantly, Rourke deliberately left a controlled gap of several inches between his stored materials and the original cabin wall. This wasn't ignorance. It was intentional design. He understood that trapping moisture against the log wall would create rot problems that could destroy the structural integrity of his main shelter. The lean-to needed to function as a storm skin, not as a sponge that held water against his home. When he finished the basic structure, Rourke immediately began filling it with what his critics called junk. Loose hay went in first, stacked 3 feet thick against the outer wall where it would provide insulation by bulk. Broken tool handles, spare boards, unused traps, and feed sacks followed, creating a dense barrier of stored materials that filled the space between the outer wall and the cabin. Haskins watched this process with growing disbelief. He built a closet for trash, he announced to anyone who would listen. 2 days of good work and pounds of nails, all to store broken handles and old hay. That lean-to won't make his cabin 1 degree warmer, but it'll give mice and rot a place to breed right against his living wall. The laughter from other settlers confirmed what Rourke had expected. His innovation would be judged harshly until it proved itself under pressure. Frontier communities were conservative about building methods for good reason. Experimental construction that failed could mean death when winter temperatures dropped below survivable levels. Men who'd survived previous winters by following established techniques saw no reason to risk their families on untested ideas. But Rourke had noticed something during construction that didn't match the standard assumptions about heat loss and wind pressure. On the coldest mornings, the section of north wall protected by his new lean-to felt measurably less brutal to the touch than the exposed walls. The difference was subtle but consistent, suggesting that his junk room might be doing more than just storing broken tools and loose hay. Winter was coming fast, and the Great Lakes region was building toward what meteorologists would later document as one of the most severe cold outbreaks in American weather history. Rourke's lean-to would face its first real test soon enough, and the community would learn whether his wasteful construction represented foolish experimentation or practical innovation that could mean the difference between survival and freezing in a frontier cabin that had never been designed to handle the extremes that February 1899 would deliver. The first bitter morning in December proved what Rourke had begun to suspect during construction. He pressed his palm against the interior north wall where the lean-to provided coverage, then moved to touch the exposed east wall. The difference was unmistakable. The protected section felt noticeably warmer, less brutal against his skin. This observation didn't fit the conventional understanding of how frontier cabins managed heat, and it suggested his junk room was performing a function that went beyond mere storage. To measure what he was experiencing, Rourke nailed a simple alcohol thermometer to the inside of the north wall, positioning it at shoulder height where he could read it easily. These spirit thermometers were common frontier tools, rugged enough to survive the rough handling of backcountry life and accurate enough to track temperature changes that mattered for survival. The readings would give him concrete data about what his lean-to was actually accomplishing. He also began conducting what frontier builders called the candle test, holding a lit candle near the log joints and chinking lines to reveal air leakage. The flame flickered and bent wherever wind pressure forced air through gaps in the wall construction. On the exposed walls, the candle showed consistent air movement at multiple points, particularly where the moss and clay chinking had dried and cracked under temperature changes. But along the north wall protected by his lean-to, the candle flame remained notably steadier, indicating reduced air infiltration. This discovery forced Rourke to reconsider the basic mechanics of heat loss in frontier construction. Standard frontier wisdom treated cold as something that seeped through walls, requiring more fuel and tighter chinking to combat. But his observations suggested that wind pressure played a larger role than most builders recognized. When wind hit a wall directly, it created pressure that forced cold air through any available gap. The lean-to was changing this equation by intercepting the wind before it could hammer his cabin wall. The mechanism became clearer as winter deepened and wind patterns intensified. The lean-to forced incoming air to hit the outer board wall first, reducing the pressure that reached the original cabin logs. This pressure reduction meant less cold air penetration, even though the chinking remained imperfect. The stored hay and materials inside the lean-to created additional resistance to air movement, further dampening the wind's ability to drive cold through the wall joints. Rourke's fuel consumption patterns supported this theory. In his previous winters, he'd fed the stove every 30 to 45 minutes during severe cold snaps, a routine that consumed enormous amounts of cordwood while still allowing frost to form on interior walls. This winter, with the lean-to in place, he could maintain comfortable interior temperatures with significantly less frequent stoking, and the dreaded interior frost appeared only during the most extreme weather events. The principle reminded him of conversations he'd had with Mika Sari, the Finnish carpenter who'd worked on several buildings in the area. Sari understood cold country construction from his old world background, where winter performance determined whether families lived or died. He'd often spoken about the importance of managing wind rather than simply fighting cold, explaining that stopping air movement was often more effective than adding more fuel to the fire. Sari's knowledge connected to documented building practices from other cold regions. Earth Lodge builders had solved similar problems through design rather than brute force, creating thick envelopes and controlled entry systems that managed wind exposure. Their structures used the principle of layered protection, multiple barriers that reduced wind pressure progressively, rather than expecting a single wall to handle all the thermal stress. Prairie sod house. Builders had applied the same logic with walls that measured around 2 feet thick. These massive walls weren't just insulation, they were wind management systems that absorbed and dissipated wind pressure before it could penetrate the living space. The thickness meant that even imperfect construction could maintain interior comfort because the wind couldn't generate enough pressure to drive cold air all the way through the wall mass. Rourke began to understand that his lean-to was creating a similar effect on a smaller scale. The 4-foot depth of stored materials was functioning as a sacrificial layer that absorbed wind impact and pressure, protecting the original cabin wall from the direct assault of winter storms. The hay bales and miscellaneous stored goods weren't just taking up space, they were serving as a buffer zone that allowed his original chinking and log work to perform better than it could when exposed to direct wind pressure. This insight explained why conventional solutions often failed during severe weather. Adding more chinking helped, but it couldn't eliminate all the gaps, and wind pressure could still force cold air through any remaining openings. Feeding the stove more frequently generated more heat, but that heat was constantly being stolen by air infiltration that no amount of fuel could completely overcome. The lean-to addressed the root cause by reducing the wind pressure that drove the infiltration in the first place. As December progressed into January, Rourke's thermometer readings confirmed the effectiveness of his approach. The protected north wall consistently measured 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the exposed walls during severe weather, a difference that translated into significantly improved living conditions and reduced fuel consumption. More importantly, the interior frost that had plagued his previous winters was now limited to brief appearances during only the most extreme cold snaps. The success was becoming obvious, enough that even his critics had begun to notice. Caleb Haskins, who dismissed the lean-to as wasteful construction, had started asking pointed questions about Rourke's fuel usage and interior comfort. Other neighbors were paying closer attention to the thermometer readings and the absence of frost patterns that marked their own cabins during cold spells. Winter was building toward something unprecedented, and weather patterns suggested that the true test of frontier building methods was approaching. The Great Lakes region was experiencing temperature drops and wind patterns that would challenge every assumption about adequate shelter construction. Rourke's useless room was about to face conditions that would determine whether his innovation represented genuine advancement or merely temporary advantage during a mild winter season. February 10, 1899, brought weather that would rewrite the record books across the American continent. The Great Arctic Outbreak descended like a hammer, driving temperatures to extremes that challenged every assumption about adequate frontier shelter. In Baldwin, Michigan, just south of Rourke's settlement, the mercury plummeted to 49 degrees below zero, establishing an all-time record that meteorologists would reference for decades. This wasn't simply cold weather, it was cold with consequences that would claim over 100 lives across the affected regions. The outbreak struck with a speed that caught even experienced frontiersmen unprepared. On February 9th, temperatures had been brutal but manageable. By the morning of the 10th, the cold had intensified to levels that turned routine survival tasks into life-threatening challenges. Water froze solid in buckets placed near active stoves. Bread dough refused to rise despite being kept close to fire. Most critically, interior temperatures in standard frontier cabins began dropping toward the freezing point, the threshold where human habitation became impossible. Rourke's thermometer readings told the story in stark numbers. The exterior temperature had dropped so far below zero that his alcohol thermometer could barely register the true depth of the cold. More importantly, maintaining interior temperatures above 32 degrees had become the entire mission of winter survival. Once water began freezing inside a dwelling, a cascade of failures followed. Food preservation became impossible, human body temperature regulation failed, and the cabin transformed from shelter into a death trap. The wind component made the temperature extremes even more deadly. This wasn't still, dry cold that could be managed with adequate fuel and thick clothing. The outbreak brought sustained winds that drove the cold through every weakness in frontier construction, creating wind chill factors that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and penetrate supposedly weatherproof shelters with devastating effectiveness. Throughout the settlement, standard cabin construction began failing under pressure it had never been designed to handle. Caleb Haskins, who'd mocked Rourke's lean-to construction, found his own carefully chinked cabin developing interior frost despite burning cord after cord of precious firewood. The chinking that had seemed adequate during normal winter weather cracked and separated under the extreme temperature differential, creating air leaks that no amount of additional fuel could compensate for. Tom O'Leary, the former lumberjack who trusted brute force solutions to most problems, discovered that his approach of feeding larger fires more frequently couldn't overcome the fundamental physics of wind-driven heat loss. His cabin's interior temperature continued dropping despite consuming firewood at an unsustainable rate, forcing him to burn furniture and floorboards to maintain even minimal warmth. The crisis revealed the deadly flaw in conventional frontier heating strategy. Standard practice treated cold as an enemy that could be defeated with more fuel, better chinking, and more frequent fire tending. But when wind pressure could drive frigid air through any imperfection in wall construction, even perfect maintenance of the fire couldn't prevent heat from being stolen faster than it could be generated. Rail transportation ground to a halt as ice and snow made track maintenance impossible. Lake traffic, which normally continued through much of winter, ceased completely as ice thickness exceeded what even the strongest vessels could navigate. The isolation meant that settlements facing fuel shortages or building failures couldn't expect rescue or resupply until the weather broke, making adequate shelter construction a matter of life and death rather than mere comfort. Across the region, families began making desperate calculations about fuel consumption versus survival time. Burning furniture and structural elements of their own cabins bought temporary warmth but created long-term problems that could prove fatal if the extreme cold persisted. Many settlers discovered that their carefully hoarded winter fuel supplies, calculated for normal severe weather, would last only days rather than weeks under the unprecedented conditions. The outbreak's duration compounded the crisis. This wasn't a brief cold snap that could be endured through emergency measures. Weather patterns indicated that the extreme conditions would persist for at least 4 to 5 days, with possible extension if the high-pressure system responsible for the Arctic air mass remained stationary over the Great Lakes region. Rourke monitored his own cabin's performance with growing confidence as the crisis deepened. His lean-to was absorbing the wind assault that was destroying his neighbors' heating systems. The outer board wall groaned and flexed under wind pressure, but it was designed to be sacrificial. Its job was to suffer, so the original cabin wall could function effectively, the stored hay. And materials inside the lean-to had frozen solid, creating an insulating mass that further reduced wind penetration. Most critically, his interior temperatures remained stable above the freezing threshold that was claiming other shelters. The thermometer mounted on his protected north wall showed readings that would have seemed impossible to his neighbors, whose own instruments registered interior temperatures approaching the danger zone where water, food, and human bodies began failing. By February 11th, the social dynamics of the settlement had shifted dramatically. Pride and conventional wisdom became luxuries that families facing freezing could no longer afford. The mockery that had greeted Rourke's wasteful construction disappeared as the mathematical reality of survival overrode community opinion about proper building methods. On the evening of February 12th, someone pounded on Rourke's door with the desperation of hands too numb to maintain dignity. Through the wind and darkness came families whose proper cabins had become uninhabitable despite their owners' best efforts at conventional solutions. The Great Arctic Outbreak was forcing a brutal education in the difference between theoretical adequacy and tested performance, and Rourke's derided innovation was about to become the proof that separated effective design from accepted practice. The Haskins family arrived first, Caleb's wife Sarah carrying their youngest child wrapped in every blanket they owned. Behind them came Tom O'Leary and his brother, both men's faces showing the gray pallor that marked the early stages of serious cold exposure. They entered Rourke's cabin without the usual frontier formalities, desperation having stripped away social conventions that seemed absurd when measured against the immediate need for survivable shelter. Rourke opened his door to families whose cabins had become uninhabitable despite following every accepted practice of frontier construction. Haskins, who dismissed the lean-to as wasteful foolishness, now stood in a cabin that maintained interior temperatures his own dwelling couldn't achieve even while burning structural lumber from his own walls. The contrast was impossible to ignore or rationalize away through appeals to conventional wisdom. The crowded conditions allowed for direct comparison that settled the technical argument definitively. Rourke's cabin, designed for one man, now sheltered multiple families while maintaining interior temperatures that kept water liquid and allowed normal conversation without the chattering teeth and violent shivering that marked the early stages of hypothermia. The thermometer readings told the story in numbers that couldn't be disputed. His protected space remained 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the failing cabins his neighbors had abandoned. The mechanism became obvious once people could observe it directly. The outer lean-to absorbed the wind assault that was destroying conventional heating systems throughout the settlement. Each gust that would have hammered directly against the cabin wall was intercepted by the sacrificial boards and stored materials, reducing the pressure differential that drove cold air through chinking gaps in log joints. Mika Sari, the Finnish carpenter, arrived with tools and lumber salvaged from his own partially frozen workshop. He'd recognized the crisis early and understood that survival now depended on rapid adoption of proven techniques rather than stubborn adherence to methods that were failing under unprecedented conditions. Sari brought the practical knowledge needed to replicate Rourke's innovation quickly and effectively. Together, they began planning emergency construction that could be completed within the narrow window before the cold became completely unsurvivable. The design needed to prioritize speed and function over appearance, using whatever materials could be scavenged or rapidly prepared. Nails became precious resources to be counted and allocated carefully, pounds of nails rather than casual trips to a supply store that might not reopen until spring. The emergency lean-to construction followed simplified rules that prioritized immediate wind protection over perfect carpentry. Rule 1. Position the buffer structure on the windward side, which in northern Michigan meant the northwest face that received the most brutal wind assault. Rule 2. Prioritize continuous coverage over aesthetic concerns. A full-length wind barrier was more effective than a partial structure that left gaps for wind penetration. Rule 3. Maintain separation between stored materials and the original cabin wall to prevent moisture trapping that could create rot problems lasting long after the crisis passed. This meant using simple racks or leaving narrow gaps that allowed air circulation while still providing wind protection. Rule 4. Focus on creating a wind-tight outer skin rather than expecting perfect construction on the inner wall. The original cabin logs only needed to be adequate if wind pressure couldn't hammer them directly. The work proceeded with the urgency that only genuine crisis could motivate. O'Leary, whose lumberjack background made him expert with rough construction, took charge of the framing work. His experience with rapid timber construction proved invaluable when working in conditions that made precision carpentry impossible and dangerous. Haskins, swallowing his pride along with his earlier criticism, provided lumber from his mill connections and helped with the board installation that would create the outer wind barrier. The emergency construction revealed how quickly conventional frontier building could be modified when survival overrode concerns about waste or appearance. Posts went up at 6-foot intervals along the north walls of multiple cabins, creating the framework for lean-to structures that could be completed in 1 to 2 days of intensive work. Rough-sawn boards created outer walls that weren't beautiful but were functionally wind-resistant. Roofing materials came from whatever sources remained accessible: boards, shakes, tar paper, and in some cases canvas or hides that would shed precipitation adequately until proper materials became available. The goal was immediate wind protection rather than long-term weatherproofing, though many of these emergency structures would prove durable enough to remain in use for years. The stored materials that filled the completed lean-tos served multiple functions beyond simple storage. Loose hay, stacked 3 to 4 feet thick against the outer walls, provided insulation through bulk mass. Feed sacks, broken tools, spare lumber, and household items that had previously seemed like clutter became valuable components of a wind-resistant system that transformed cabin thermal performance. Sarah Rourke documented the process with the practical record-keeping skills that frontier women applied to all survival-critical activities. Her notes tracked interior temperature changes, fuel consumption rates, and comfort levels that provided measurable proof of the technique's effectiveness. These records would become the evidence that convinced skeptical neighbors to adopt the method permanently rather than viewing it as emergency construction. The transformation in community attitude was immediate and complete. Men who'd called Rourke's lean-to a closet for trash now worked to replicate the design on their own cabins, asking technical questions about post spacing, board gaps, and material storage that they'd dismissed as worthless details only days before. The February outbreak had forced a practical education in the difference between accepted methods and effective methods. By February 14th, as the worst of the outbreak began to moderate, the settlement had been transformed. Multiple cabins now featured storm sheds and lean-to additions that changed their thermal performance dramatically. The useless room had acquired a new name among people who'd experienced its life-saving function directly. They called it a storm layer, recognizing its role as a sacrificial barrier that protected living space from wind assault. Rourke, watching his neighbors work to complete their own wind protection systems, didn't offer speeches about vindication or criticize the conventional wisdom that had nearly cost lives. Instead, he handed tools to anyone who needed help and shared technical details that would make their emergency construction more effective. The crisis had proven his method, but the real victory was measured in families who would survive the remainder of the winter in cabins that could now maintain livable interior temperatures. By the time the Great Arctic Outbreak released its grip on northern Michigan in late February, the settlement had fundamentally changed its approach to winter construction. What had begun as one man's mocked innovation had become community standard practice, adopted not through gradual persuasion, but through the brutal education of crisis survival. The storm sheds and lean-to additions that dotted the landscape represented more than emergency construction. They marked a permanent shift toward building methods that prioritized wind management over conventional wisdom. Within a single season, multiple homesteads had copied and refined the storm layer concept. The emergency structures built during the February crisis proved so effective that families invested additional labor and materials to improve and winterize them for long-term use. What started as rough wind barriers became integrated parts of domestic architecture, serving functions that extended far beyond their original crisis-driven purpose. The replication process revealed how quickly practical innovations could spread through frontier communities when survival validated their effectiveness. Tom O'Leary, whose lumberjack skills had made him invaluable during the emergency construction phase, became an unofficial expert in storm shed building. His experience with rapid timber construction translated directly into techniques for adding wind protection layers to existing cabins, and he found himself helping neighbors throughout the region adapt their shelters. The method connected to documented patterns in American frontier building that extended far beyond northern Michigan. Daniel Carter Beard's comprehensive surveys of frontier architecture had recorded numerous examples of what he called mossback construction, practical add-ons and shed roof divisions that established builders often dismissed as backward or primitive. These structures, which included attached pens, storage lean-tos, and buffer rooms, represented adaptive responses to climate challenges that formal building traditions hadn't adequately addressed. The practice of banking houses with seasonal insulation provided another historical parallel to Rourke's. Innovation. Farmers throughout cold regions routinely banked their dwellings with earth, manure, straw, or other materials that created sacrificial layers against winter wind. These techniques were common enough to be photographed and documented as standard practice, though they were often dismissed by more prosperous builders who could afford alternative heating methods. Ingenious earth lodge design demonstrated the same climate logic on a more sophisticated scale. These structures managed wind and temperature through carefully planned form and mass, using controlled exposure and layered protection rather than relying purely on fuel consumption to maintain interior comfort. The engineering principles behind earth lodge construction, thick envelopes, wind management, and thermal mass, applied directly to the storm layer concept that had saved the settlement. Sod house construction, documented throughout the Great Plains, provided another example of climate-adapted building that prioritized thermal performance over appearance. Typical sod dwellings measured 14 feet by 16 feet, with walls around 2 feet thick, dimensions that demonstrated how frontier builders in harsh climates understood the necessity of massive thermal barriers. These thick walls weren't excessive, they represented practical responses to wind and temperature extremes that thinner construction couldn't handle effectively. The February 1899 outbreak remained the proof point that validated the technique and provided the crisis narrative that spread the method beyond its original location. Weather records documented the event as one of the most severe cold episodes in American meteorological history, establishing the credibility needed to convince conservative builders that extraordinary preparation wasn't wasteful, but essential. Sarah Rourke's detailed records of temperature differences, fuel consumption, and comfort levels provided the quantitative evidence that transformed community opinion. Her documentation showed that protected cabins maintained interior temperatures 8 to 12 degrees warmer than exposed structures while consuming significantly less firewood. These measurements gave the innovation credibility that went beyond anecdotal success stories. The social transformation was equally significant. Caleb Haskins, who'd represented the voice of conventional building wisdom, became one of the technique's most effective advocates. His conversion from skeptic to supporter carried weight because of his established expertise and his initial resistance to the method. When men like Haskins endorsed innovations they'd previously mocked, the community paid attention. Reverend James Whitcomb, whose circuit riding gave him perspective across multiple settlements, began including the storm layer lesson in his conversations with other communities. His role as chronicler and moral teacher made him an effective carrier of practical knowledge, and he framed the technique as preparation wisdom rather than mere building advice. Through his influence, the method spread beyond the original settlement to other homesteading areas facing similar climate challenges. The generational impact became apparent as the technique evolved beyond emergency shelter modification. New construction began incorporating wind protection principles from the design stage, creating cabins with integrated storm layers rather than added-on emergency structures. The mudroom and backroom that would become standard features in American domestic architecture traced their origins to innovations like Rourke's lean-to, though later builders often forgot the climate management purposes that had originally justified the wasted space. The long-term adoption patterns demonstrated how crisis-driven innovations could become permanent improvements in regional building practice. Structures built during the February emergency remained in use for decades, their effectiveness validated by repeated winter seasons that never again reached the extremes of 1899, but regularly tested the adequacy of frontier shelter systems. The method's success lay in its fundamental simplicity. It changed the thermal equation by managing wind pressure rather than fighting cold through brute force, by creating sacrificial layers that absorbed wind impact before it could drive cold air through chinking gaps, The storm shed principle addressed the root cause of heat loss rather than merely treating symptoms with additional fuel. The lesson extended beyond construction techniques to encompass broader principles of climate adaptation and resource management. Communities that learned to build storm layers also learned to think systematically about wind patterns, thermal protection, and the difference between adequate and tested performance standards. These insights influenced everything from barn construction to workshop design, creating a building culture that prioritized function over appearance and long-term performance over short-term economy. When the wind could no longer touch the living wall, the cold lost its leverage. This simple principle, proven through crisis and validated through measurement, became embedded in the building wisdom that frontier communities passed to succeeding generations, ensuring that the lessons learned during the Great Arctic Outbreak would prevent future tragedies when winter storms tested the adequacy of human shelter against the unforgiving mathematics of survival.